All right, thanks everyone for joining us in person and online. We have about 25 participants online, and I'm sure more will trickle in the next couple minutes or so. So this is a different seminar format than we're used to, but we're going to do it panelist format, and our first one is on flood hazard mitigation. And Eric Roy is going to take it away and moderate for us. And we will have participants chiming in on the chat online, and you can just type in your questions and I can facilitate that back out to Eric and our participants. So thank you, and we can get started.
All right, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Eric Roy. I'm a faculty affiliate at the Water Resources Institute. And I am going to first introduce our panelists and then turn it over to them to say a few words about their work in this area. And then I have some questions I'll kind of get the Q&A started with, and then hopefully you'll jump in and we can have a really good conversation together. So first I want to introduce Stephanie Smith. Stephanie Smith is the Hazard Mitigation Section Chief at Vermont Emergency Management, and has been part of the hazard mitigation team since 2016. Stephanie manages the hazard mitigation team, including FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance grant programs, the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, as well as coordination of state hazard mitigation plan development and implementation. She holds a master's in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And then in the middle here, we have Hans Estrin. Hans spent much of his time as a boy rock hopping, bushwhacking, and fishing the banks and channels of upper Winooski tributaries. Later, as a grad student in UVM's Field Naturalist program, he studied stream bank restoration and then authored a Montpelier Rivers Report, where he used local high school students that's authored a report used by local high school students for over a decade. Drawn to water, wilderness, teaching, and farming, Hans helped found the High Mountain Institute in Leadville, Colorado, and then taught ecological sciences in Vermont, Turkey, and Kazakhstan, and grew as much food as he could. For the past 15 years with UVM Extension and a local food coordinator, Hans has helped leading producers in Vermont and New England grow their farms while increasing the ecological and market sustainability of their farms. Hans co-founded the Wyndham Farm and Food Network, now Food Connects, and is now the co-founder and coordinator of UVM's Community Accreditation for Produce Safety and a technical consultant with UVM's Ag Engineering team. Recent climate intensified flooding of produce farms has refocused Hans' work on flood recovery and resilience of Vermont's communities and their food systems. In 2023, he and Walter Coleman, director of the Field Naturalist program, co-developed and now coordinate UVM's Ecological Planning Lab. From the Mad and Winooski to the West and Clyde River watersheds, Hans is now matching up UVM's ecological planning, research, and educational resources with community-led projects. Leveraging UVM internships, GIS mapping, and participatory action research, Hans is now exploring ways for the EPL to connect and empower community-based partnerships at the watershed scale. And then finally, we have Shayne Jaquith. Shayne is a river scientist and has been the Watershed Restoration Program Manager for the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy since 2016. His work involves the restoration and protection of Vermont's rivers and wetlands, flood resiliency, and water quality. Prior to working with TNC, he was a river scientist for the Vermont DEC Rivers Program for 16 years, where he helped assess the physical condition of Vermont's rivers, worked to develop river restoration projects, and provided technical assistance to river managers, including transportation infrastructure managers, farmers, and other landowners. So great panel here today. I was hoping you could each take 3 to 5 minutes to say a bit more about your work in this area. We'll start with you, Stephanie.
All right. That's a whole lot of expertise to follow. So I've got some big friends in this room. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I've been working with Emma for a few years on various things, but haven't made it to this building yet. So it's good to see the space that you guys live in. The hazard mitigation program at Vermont Emergency Management. So it's a state program. Mostly we're managing FEMA funding, FEMA dollars. But unlike some of the other FEMA programs, our program is managed completely by the state. So instead of FEMA coming in and doing public assistance or individual assistance more directly with communities, my team is managing that funding on behalf of our communities. And the focus within that is very much on how we reduce our long-term future risk. The caveat that I'll give is that when people are most interested in hazard mitigation funding is when bad things have happened. So the intent of the program is that long-term planning and thinking around how we reduce our risk. The reality is we're doing a lot of long-term recovery work like property buyouts. And there's a lot of consternation around how long those things take, what sort of program that it fits for that property buyout mold, but it's not a recovery program. And that's an important distinction. So we end up doing that because that's when people are interested. So the majority of my day right now, we're spent talking about property buyouts, working with our communities to support buyouts. And then when we have time and funding available, the focus is really on large floodplain restoration projects. How do we give the river back the space that it used to occupy, remove fill that's been added over time, lower flood risk within our communities. So on the grant program, that's very much the focus with FEMA funding and then with our state dollars through the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. And then the planning side is the other half of our shop. So we support communities in local hazard mitigation plan development. Those plans expire every 5 years. They're required in order to access any FEMA funding, and they're done at the municipal level in Vermont because that's our level of government. Most of the country, they're done at a county level. That's not how our government lives in Vermont. And a state hazard mitigation plan. So on the grant side, very focused on flood reduction. The state hazard mitigation plan, which we update every 5 years, presents all of the natural hazards that Vermont is vulnerable to, lays out how we're vulnerable, what we might be able to do about it, proposes a strategy for how we reduce our future long-term risk. So flooding, inundation and erosion, there's 2 separate hazards listed there, erosion being our number 1 hazard, inundation flooding being secondary. That's very much the focus of the plan, but it goes over all of the hazards that we're vulnerable to. So that's really the high-level focus of my program.
Thanks, Stephanie. So I work primarily with the University of Vermont Extension, and I'm just curious if you know much about Extension, a few of you. So I won't say much except that our grand mission is to cultivate communities and cultivate healthy communities. And so, of course, that begs the question: what is health, and how are we going to do this work? And I work primarily in agroecology and with farmers, right, and produce farmers. Most of them organic farmers. I work with about 150 growers pretty intensely. Got a lot of cell phone numbers on my phone, and so I'm like boots on the ground. Like this is like in the mud and a lot of the best leading farms have the acreage in on floodplains, right? So you see it in the headlines and see the photos. I work a lot on, we meet growers where they are with Extension, right? I'm sort of like a case manager in a lot of ways, but how can we gather resources to help you and stuff like that? And I say, so, Joe, what's on your mind? What are you thinking about with your farm? And I have a certain, things I can offer, but I can pull together a lot of resources. So that's the kind of work we do. I work with a team of about 6 other Extension professionals, faculty, and we connect with other people in the university, many researchers who have part-time affiliates with Extension, and then many researchers who don't. They're just really interested in community-based participatory action research, et cetera. So it's been a pretty exciting time, just even the last 15 years I've been doing this. More recently, of course, with the flooding, this has really come to a head. And, an example might be Footbrook Farm, right? Like, so I work with them real closely. And, just these farm gets completely inundated, 2 times in the last, 10 years, but they have millions of dollars at stake and is their livelihood, and they hire a bunch of people. And, I was talking to Joey after this last flood, and it was like 3 days after, and I actually went out there, and they're like, silt all over their wash pack shed, and it's like they have all of these pallets of organic fertilizer sitting in the muck, and they've been like, they're just hardened up like cake, and so questions were, well, is this stuff dangerous if it gets wet, or is it going to heat up and get like how can we get rid of it? So we spent like state people like so long trying to solve this problem, right? And he's like, well, why don't I just take it out of the field and I'll sort of run it over with the tractor a bunch of times, see if I can block. So long story short, I get the feeling working at this level that we are not doing a great job of responding and actually allowing at the state level from afar, helping farms and meet hazards, prepare for hazards, understand. So just a lot of sort of reeling afterwards, and farmers that are at the end of their rope from all these people trying to help, but there's not really a way to help. So this has kind of led me in part back to some of my first loves of, being along rivers and doing that kind of work, restoration ecology, and with Walter Pullman, who I've known for a long time in the Field Naturalist program. And the Ecological Planning Lab is designed specifically to put together the Field Naturalist program and UVM extension into an ecological extension service, where we would work really as case managers long-term to plug in sort of the ecological planning resources at the university and connect them to empower communities and community-based projects that are working towards, in this case, flood resilience over time, flood response, better planning, that kind of stuff. So I'll just illustrate really quickly with an example. So we've been working in the Mad River Valley. And our main job really is to connect the dots, if you think about it. We're not offering a silver bullet. We're trying to actually find synergy between community leaders with a lot of energy and research at UVM, mostly community-based, participatory action research, mapping expertise, and internships and service learning opportunities. And there's a lot of them. So you can imagine creating like a course catalog almost for communities and being a matchmaker and working with communities over time. It's a lot about relationship building and case management over time. So we're working in the Mad River Valley right now with a knotweed project. And what's kind of cool is you might say, well, what does that have to do with flooding? But many of you know knotweed is a really interesting case. Talk about connecting the dots. And if we go back to, we go back to channelizing rivers and and the sediment building up. And Irene is a big player, right? Knotweed's been around since 1920s, but through a very complicated sort of series of events and flooding, knotweed is really now taken over many of our riparian waterways and driving biodiversity down and increasing the intensity of flooding over time. So we're into our second year there and doing all sorts of projects. One of the main ones I'm most excited about, and I'm just going to stop because there's plenty more to talk about, is what's really needed is like these guys. This is 3 towns: Waitsfield, Warren, and Facein, really energized groups, but they can't do this alone, even though they're like super powerful, right? And this is just not we. So they came to us and like, what we really need help with is we've been doing this GIS work for a long time and it's on all these different computers and we can't figure out how to put it together. Can you help us? We're like, yes, we can help you. So the mission of actually on the broader scale, thinking watershed scale, developing real system and systematology that could be used across watersheds to help engage, like a container for engagement of these empowered community groups to really start tracking their progress in doing restoration work in the community. Not only knotweed stuff, but it could be tree plantings, it could be stream bank restoration, it could be riparian stuff, it could be upland stuff, but having systems where we can actually track that over time and dashboards where communities can start to build a story really around what they're doing and connect lots of different groups. And so that synergy is what's really key. No one group's going to do it alone. It's together, this sort of emergence of all these different solutions of people working together that we're working towards. So I'll stop there.
It's great. Give me a lot of ideas. Let's talk. All right, I'll talk. So yeah, hi everybody. Shayne Jaquith again with the Nature Conservancy, watershed restoration scientist or coordinator, depending on the day. So the Nature Conservancy, just a little bit of background. It's a global organization. It's science-driven, nonpartisan conservation organization. We have chapters in 72 countries around the world. We have a chapter in every state in the US, including Vermont, which has been in existence for just over 60 years. I think we're best known in Vermont as a land protection organization. I think we have over 300,000 acres of land across 50 different natural areas, and we've also helped to conserve a lot of the lands that are currently owned by the state of Vermont, the wildlife management areas, et cetera. So that's a little bit about the Conservancy generally. Here in Vermont, in addition to our land protection work and stewardship work, and some other things that we do, we have a freshwater program. And the primary focus of the freshwater program currently consists of like 3 major pillars, and those are dam removal, river corridor protection, and river floodplain restoration. So I'm going to start with the river corridor protection work. That work is comprised primarily of work by our government relations team in the State House over the last session to advocate and help pass the River Safety Bill, Act 121, and which protects river corridors statewide. It creates a new permitting program to be administered by the state to protect river corridors. So that's our river corridor piece. The second piece is dam removal. We manage a pretty modest portfolio of dam removal projects. I have 2 ongoing right now. And we continue to roll into new ones as we complete others. But that's a pretty small amount of work. And another piece of dam removal work is that we are continually raising private dollars to help our partners fund their dam removal projects. So we're trying to, beyond just what we do, we're trying to help others scale up their work around dam removal. So that's the dam removal piece. And then the river and floodplain restoration piece. What we're doing on that front currently is really helping to advance low-tech, process-based approaches to conserving, restoring rivers, wetlands, and floodplains. So these are processes by which we add the missing components back to these systems to help drive those natural processes that create and maintain high quality habitat, water quality, and flood resilience. So really simply put, we like to cut trees into forested streams, and we like to build fake beaver dams and other little wood structures in streams in the field. But that's really what we're helping to do right now, what we're working on, because we feel like a lot of the really expensive engineered river restoration approaches, while always will be needed in certain situations, are only a part of the puzzle. And we really need to bring these low tech and low cost approaches. We feel that they have better outcomes. We feel that they are more engaging because we can all do this work. We don't need to be professionally trained hydraulics engineers and hydrologists and fluvial geomorphologists. So all these community groups that you talk about, we can bring in and have them work on these projects. And I don't know if I said it already, but the low cost piece, right? The scale of degradation of our river systems across the state and really around the world is just tremendous. So we need these low cost approaches so that we can match that scale of degradation with the scale of restoration. So those are the 3 things that we're working on in the freshwater work at the Nature Conservancy, and I guess I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So I'm going to start with a question, but I would encourage anyone online, anyone in the room, if you have a follow-up question that builds nicely on the discussion, go ahead and raise your hand, or online, raise your hand there too, or put it in the chat. And we'll try to make this a dynamic session. So the question to get us started off, and any of you can take this, is how can we ensure that flood hazard mitigation is integrated into community-wide planning across sectors?
Well, I'll start with so we work with the municipal level predominantly, and the local hazard mitigation plan is the area where we support our communities in doing that work. It is not a perfect system. We're meeting FEMA requirements. They went up a year and a half ago. They significantly raised the bar in what's required to be within those documents, which makes it incredibly challenging for our communities because they're just trying to check the boxes so that they can get funding. And that's not conducive to integrating it with their other plans and making it really part of what they're doing. So we're trying within those requirements, because we can't change that federal level, to support our communities in better understanding what those plans are, better coordinating them with other documents. And we're also working with the Climate Action Office at the Agency of Natural Resources, they're working on a climate resilience planning tool that the hope is that helps better integrate it with other plans, and recognizing that they have to have a local hazard mitigation plan to access funding. It's incentivized through the state's Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. So it's one of the things that if you have that plan in place, when we have a federally declared disaster, you get additional state cost share in the public assistance program. So the state is incentivizing this plan. It's required in order to access grants. So we want to be able to take that and make it more useful for our communities. And I think this project with the Climate Action Office is an exciting opportunity to help move that a little bit and better coordinate it with other things that they're doing. And instead of adding a new thing, better coordinating it within existing plans.
Can I ask an add-on? But what if the community is like a population of 3,000 and half of those people are under 18?
Yeah, it's the municipal level is probably not the best strategy based on the requirement. When FEMA is looking at what those requirements for the plans are, they're looking at county government. So the fact that we have to do 281 of them instead of 14 is incredible. And my team has to review those. That's our time, that's town time. So, and I think it's not conducive necessarily to thinking about a watershed scale, which we're also trying to support our communities in doing when all of these requirements are just at the municipal level. So there's a lot of challenges within that. And I know there's a government right sizing study going on, and that's something that I've been asked about a bit to say, well, should this plan actually be at a regional level, which would be great and maybe more conducive to meeting the requirements, but also engaging communities in a more meaningful way, and better using capacity. If we could do 14 instead of 281.
I'd like to speak to that 200 population town. I think it's really the work FEMA is doing and the work this sort of top-down and watershed scale is absolutely essential for holding this sort of container for connection of communities. But I also think, and I've witnessed that this bottom-up thing has to be there too. And that's where like the energy, so like follow the money, right? Like follow the energy. Where are people actually doing things? And you can go, and talk to people and understand from a case management approach what their challenges are. Then all of a sudden you're going to be connecting just by nature of how you ask the questions, all of these different sectors that have to be drawn together. So if you want to actually help a person, you're going to have, connect well, it could be, the GIS mapping expertise, spatial analysis lab, it could be hydrologists, it could be, field naturalists doing ecological inventories, all of this different and state labs and ANR and Nature Conservancy, et cetera. The one thing I learned too, which sort of has really stuck with me, is a couple of years ago, started to learn a lot about emergency management planning and getting into that mostly in line of duty, right, with farmers doing this. And, I just remember the head of emergency management here at UVM, he's like, what's the first thing that happens when an emergency happens? What's the first thing that happens? You lose your phone, you lose all contact, all the experts are not going to be there. So, so you need to actually ask yourself, if no one was here and I had to respond, so it's your neighbor. So it's like, meet your neighbor. What are this is sort of the general thing. It's like, what are your assets? What are your liabilities? Like, who has the strengths? Where are the people? Making connections in your town. So the thing about that is it's like prior, the 5 Ps I've taught in wilderness, expeditions: prior planning prevents piss poor performance. Like, you have to really connect with everyone, and to make an honest plan, understand what is going on. And those connections build trust between people, and the trust is an act. Building a plan is an act of resilience. That is where the energy for this stuff comes from. That energy to connect and understand where your resources are then goes out to the broader, bigger regional resources, the state resources. And I think as a case manager, if you're on that, you can use that energy to actually bring some of those groups together to have more holistic plans, which would be at the watershed scale, I think.
So this
Can I
is a
ask a
great.
follow- Oh, sorry, no.
Yeah.
I think both of you kind of spoke to the capacity challenges that are very inherent in Vermont, and also the fact that like everyone wears a lot of hats. A lot of hats. But I'm curious if you could speak at all to the role that partnership across lines plays in the development of more resilient planning, more resilient communities, and maybe if you have a good example of a partnership that's worked well in the context of this work.
I have an example of what we're just trying to figure out, but I've talked, so if you have something.
No, go ahead.
This is a newer thing, but it was a very hopeful experience for me, which is there was a convening back in, I think, early December of the Winooski watershed. So of people from all of the towns in the entire Winooski watershed coming together to talk about, okay, this isn't just a my town problem with my edges. This is the Winooski. So how do we look at this a little more holistically? And I think in my past experience, that is not the conversation we've been having. And the best example in that room was someone from the town of Washington, which is a very small town that's in the headwaters of the Winooski, but someone from that town recognizing that what we do is going to impact the people below us. We're a really small town. We have a lot less capacity, but how do we work together to make sure that what we're doing isn't making your flooding worse? And it feels like there's a bit of a shift there. Like we're seeing more of that perspective in a way that feels really powerful to me. So that doesn't get exactly at what you're saying, but I think that partnership of recognizing the town boundaries don't mean anything compared to water.
Not an example of partnerships, no.
I can add one. I mean, in general, I think partnerships where people are coming in with different ideas, you get emergent solutions that no one could think of by themselves. So I don't know, I'm just thinking of one meeting we had right with this Matt River group where we were talking about the gravel contamination, and it happened that day that someone from the Forest Service was there, and we ended up like going by the town garage. And so just this conversation got going, and then this guy who was part of the town garage said, oh, we had this gravel crusher a while back, like that did, it's like breaking up rock. And then, then what the guy from Warren said, oh, well, I know that if you actually break up knotweed into little pieces and you just like leave it out, then it could actually, it'll die. It won't actually have any vitality. And just like that kind of stuff, where getting these ideas that just through talking amongst different people with different expertise, you'll come up with these solutions that wouldn't have really happened without those partnerships.
I have an online question, and it's kind of related because it's about knotweed, and then I'll let Eric get back to it. But is Mad River coordinating with agri-tech goat herders for the knotweed removal? Washington Electric, Stowe Electric, and a few ski areas use this low-tech knotweed removal successfully.
So agri-tech, I'm not that familiar with, but that was one of the projects that was piloted this last summer. There's a herd of about 40 goats and a herder, and they managed about 10 acres and have sort of had competitions, goats against the student interns, right, who are working there.
Who won?
It was not really that comparable. The students did a much cleaner job. The goats were like all wild, but the goats would cover a lot of ground, and they're really into it. And they had the baby goats too, so the cube factor was much higher. So I don't know about that, but it is a possibility. There are technical challenges, logistical challenges, financial challenges. And I would love, yeah, it's a great idea, and I hope it continues.
So I'll ask one that's more on this, along the lines of ecological approaches to restoration. Shayne, I guess I'll direct this to you, but anybody can weigh in as well. How can natural floodplain restoration and wetland preservation contribute to flood hazard mitigation? Do you have some successful examples of these ecological approaches in Vermont?
Yeah, so I guess, when we think about that question, I go back to the fact that, the situation we're right now really started in the 1600s with fur trapping, right? Fur trappers came through, nearly extirpated all the beaver, right? All those beaver dams slowly decayed, and right, our hydrologic systems changed dramatically. And that was followed then by the snagging of those streams. All of the dead wood that had fallen into those streams over hundreds of years was removed to facilitate log drives, right? And then we straightened and dredged and armored these systems to accommodate adjacent land uses. And in so doing, created tremendously deep, efficient conveyances. The problem with that, right? Everything we've done has been to, and continually, like if we look around, everything we do is to drain the landscape, right? Everything we do as modern humans really, unless we're farming rice and perhaps some other things, but by and large, we're draining, everything we do requires draining the landscape, right? The drainage industry is enormous. So the problem with that, of course, is that, we can drain our land, but that water ends up on someone else's land, right? The town of Washington's water ends up somewhere downstream on someone else's land. But, perhaps, it was the lack of data that told us what, sort of flood magnitudes and frequencies were when the Europeans were first settling that, and perhaps it was a little bit of hubris around how much we could control forces of nature's that led us to develop those flood vulnerable lands anyway. So that is everything that's occurred. We've created these incredibly deep channels, super efficient conveyances, but because they flow through very erodible sands and gravels and cobbles, they're very unstable currently. So, this flood hazard issue we have is a result of all of those stressors and management decisions we've made as a society. So it just like when we think about that, the obvious answer is that we need to restore these really deep, unstable, efficient water conveyances to the large wood and beaver dam and landslide clogged conveyances that very slowly moved water and filtered it along the way and sank it back into the hyporheic zone and into the aquifers, right? And stored it, thereby, reducing flood peaks. So in general, I think, it's converting, it's really taking the efficiency out of our conveyance systems and making room for the accumulation and residency of water on places spread out throughout the landscape, right? And so I think that really is what we need to, a big piece. So that's how wetland restoration, conservation, and stream and floodplain restoration conservation, that's how they fit into this picture.
In your introduction, you were talking about the low cost approaches for the restorations. If you compare with the hard engineering approaches that are targeted in terms of reach scale, were you able to implement your approaches on a larger scale somewhere in Vermont, where we can use our applied water research to compare how both are working or something like that?
So I've had a little bit of a head cold the last few days, so I'm having a hard time hearing. But can we expand?
Do you implemented your low cost approaches on a larger scale somewhere here?
Yeah. So That's what we need. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to scale up the use of the low tech approach, right? And we're hindered in that a little bit. Well, one, we're bringing this new approach to Vermont, this approach that really hasn't been utilized in Vermont a whole lot. So we're introducing, the practitioners, the regulators, and the funders to this new approach, and having to demonstrate that it is indeed effective. So first, we have to clear that barrier, and in order to do that, we start with small projects. We get the regulators comfortable with these projects, and we show the funders that, so the small projects then grow to, an increased use of this approach, right? But the second hurdle that we then have to cross is the fact that we don't really have, we have somewhat of, who was it? The guy that owns Ecotone down in Maryland, I believe. I think his name's James McMillan, but he's referred to the eco-industrial complex. And there is kind of an eco-industrial complex around restoration, right? We have our engineers and our fluvial geomorphologists and our hydrologists, and they help to make projects happen, right? We have the big earth moving companies that they all get together and make those big engineered projects happen. Well, we don't really have that same complex around really low tech projects. It's almost like too inexpensive creates this problem because nobody can make a lot of money doing it, right? It's really kind of this paradox. And so we're trying to overcome that now through a number of different efforts. One idea that we have is to really bring the forestry community, the logging community, arborists, landscapers, and others who are well geared to do the type of work, but just need to understand like the river processes and dynamics and biology and ecosystems so that they can do the work in a way that achieves the good outcomes, right? So we need to train these people, and we need to help them understand the benefits that it can be for their businesses, which means we need to get the funding sources going and the projects identified so there's enough projects so that a number of different potential practitioners look at this body of work and say, you know what, I can increase my revenue stream around that work. I'm going to add that to my business model, right? So it's kind of a catch-22 number of ways, but we're working to clear some hurdles to increase the use of these low-tech approaches across the landscape, because it is really a distributed approach, right? It's really applicable to the very smallest of streams, the first and second order streams. And those are the streams that make up 70 to 80% of our watersheds in most cases. So it's really a distributed approach far and wide. So when I hear like the work you're doing with local groups and the synergies that you can achieve and helping them connect the dots, to take different approaches, that kind of thing is really exciting, because I think if we can connect this work with those types of groups, we can really start the ball rolling. Yeah.
Like let's say that the policymaker is asking you a question, and he will ask you that what is the probability your approach will be successful, and why we should not go with the engineering designs. I know that the engineering designs are getting failed most of the time, but how you will say that our approach will be successful? Yeah, I'm going to sit in the House Fish and Wildlife Natural Resources Committee on Wednesday, so I'm going to have that conversation in just a couple of days. One thing we can point to the work that has been done out west. The folks that have really created this approach, developed this approach, and done a lot of the research, the good sound research to document its success. And I'm thinking of organizations like the Ecological Restoration Consortium out of Utah State that works with BLM, works with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, works with NOAA. They've done a lot of this work out there, and they've really done a great job of documenting success. So we point elsewhere to other regions. But then another great thing that we have is that the Fish and Wildlife Department here in Vermont has actually been doing this work for about 15 years now, up in the Northeast Kingdom in the Nullhegan River Basin, and they've started to document some really great success there.
So there's those successes, looking to the literature, and there is literature out there that is supportive, but more research could always be beneficial. More local research could always be beneficial. So that would be helpful as of now. And as we did when we brought the engineered approach to Vermont 20 years ago, sort of the natural channel design approach, we had to point to other regions of the country that had pioneered this approach, and we had to say, look over there, it's working there, we can bring it here, and ask for some trust in that it would work here as well. So yeah.
I get charged 99 cents a month for Google, services or whatever, but 99 cents, how are they making money? Well, there's billions and billions of them, right? So I would just add that small scale approach, like there's 2 million acres of current use land, forested land in the state of Vermont. And many of these are second home landowners. Many of them are conservation minded, and they have loggers logging their properties.
Yeah.
There's kids in schools who need community service credit. They need 40 hours of credit to do projects in communities to graduate. That's a law at the state. So if you just add back a napkin and you start thinking about, these are very low, the techniques are not hard, and it requires follow-up. But that's even lower tech, but say contour felling, for example, is not woody screen, but that's even easier, right? And anyone can do that. You can learn it in a couple hours, whatever. It's a great exercise. So if you just start penciling this stuff out, I think you can make a convincing argument pretty quick that it could be very effective, but you have to have some models. You gotta get started. You gotta spark the thing somehow.
Yeah. So we, as an example, we have a proposed project, the funding proposal to the U.S. Forest Service for a project that would create a training program to train the existing watershed organizations and foresters and loggers and match them up so that the watershed organizations know to go to the foresters, because the foresters are out on their clients' lands all the time. They're walking the lands all the time. They're seeing streams out there. The watershed organizations, very limited resources. They're in their office most of the time. If they want to start to drum up projects, they have to cold call people, or they have to go out and make site visits. And that's really intensive work. Why not pair them up with the foresters who are out there on the landscape all the time? And so that and train the foresters so they know what to look for. They can recognize an incised stream, and they can look at the canopy, the riparian, stocking density, and say, what, this stream's a great fit, would be a great fit for wood addition. I'm going to call the Friends of the Winooski or the Lewis Creek or whatever watershed organization it is, and I'm going to talk to the executive director because I met them at this training, and we're going to go for some funding. We're going to go to the DEC Clean Water Funds to develop a project to do some wood, to do some large wood addition on my client's lands. And so that's kind of the idea that we're trying to work on right now.
I simply wanted to point out that I think, Shayne, you had said earlier you didn't have an example of partnership, and you lied. That's a magnificent example of partnership, and that's what incredible power behind it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask?
We need science too. We need numbers, quantitative numbers too. You can see fundings and get models, but to actually develop something like this, it needs good doctorate students on it for a while, actually documenting what is going on when you do this stuff so that you can go after the big bucks and people are like, oh yeah, this is convincing.
So I'm from computer science domain, so with a little domain science knowledge. So you mentioned about the dam removal. I don't know what's the reason for that.
What's the reason for removing dams?
Yeah.
We have a lot of dams that were installed, since Europeans first started to settle the landscape. And there has never, once you build a dam, there's never really an incentive to remove it. So they age, they aren't maintained, they become hazardous. And there's really nobody other than, primarily it's the non-governmental organizations, the nonprofits with the conservation mission. American Rivers is another one that's out there in Vermont, the Vermont Natural Resources, VNRC, Vermont Natural Resources Council, and the Connecticut River Conservancy, ourselves, TNC, some of the watershed orgs with those missions are working to remove those dams, to remove the hazards, remove the ecological impacts that they present, because they present ecological impacts. A really simple one is the fact that these large impoundments, these ponds upstream of dams, get very warm. So it makes the streams uninhabitable for some of the cold water species that exist in these streams. So there's ecological benefits, there's safety benefits to removing a lot of these structures. So that's why we do that.
Just as a follow-up to promoting the more low-tech solutions, is part of the problem more of the funding model? Because I'm more familiar with the state clean water funds, and they're so regimented about you have to get your 30% design in, then your 60% design, then your 90%, whatever. And I have to imagine that's not as applicable to creating a beaver dam analog, but it still requires some funding to do it. So is part of the problem there just isn't as many avenues to get funding for these types of projects? You just drove the nail right through the 2x4. Yeah. And just really quickly, because I feel like I've kept us on this question for a long time. So really quickly, process-based projects are very different than engineered projects, right? Because, and I don't know if maybe you're thinking the same thing, maybe you're thinking exactly what I'm going to say. Engineered projects, you put it on paper, you bring in the machinery, and when you put it on paper, you tell the clean water funder that, look, this is what it's going to look like when I'm done, and this is going to generate so much phosphorus reduction credit, right? Process-based restoration, you throw the wood in the stream and I shouldn't just do that, but you have to wait for the natural processes to happen, right? And this a little bit, because you can put wood in a stream and not get a high flow event for 10 years, and that wood doesn't really do anything. Or you put wood in the stream, and 2 years later you get the flood of 23, and it rearranges that wood and stacks it up and brings in a bunch of gravel that's being transported downstream of that flood, and it builds up right behind that wood, and it fills the channel, reconnecting to the floodplain, and it's like you get your phosphorus outcomes like within 2 years, right? So that makes it a little bit more challenging and harder. The state is, I do have to say, the people I'm working with are trying their best because they recognize the value of it, and they are trying hard to make it fit within. And I don't, it starts with the EPA system, right? The whole TMDL. So it's a tough one, but yes, you're right on the mark with that.
This is a really interesting corner we could stay. I have a lot of thoughts on that too, but I want to switch more to communication. We've got 10 minutes left. We talked a little bit about emergency management earlier, and Hans, you had some great ideas that you shared for communities to prepare. How can emergency management teams better educate the public about flood risks to begin with?
Your department.
It's hard. When you started that question, I was thinking about municipal responses and not the education approach, and the need to be planning for recovery in advance and understanding that if we have a declared disaster, public assistance funding is coming. Don't just put it back. Let's have a plan for what we do to actually improve things when we do have that funding available. With the communications piece, it's hard. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. I mean, we have municipalities doing local emergency management plans that are required to be updated every year. It's not a terribly thorough, robust process that gets community engagement involved. It's a who do we need to call when everything's hitting the fan sort of plan. And I think leaves some things to be desired in that space. So that's a non-answer.
Hans, any additional thoughts?
I would just say, I think it goes back to that process-based solutions require partnerships, they require communication, they require networking, and you can increase the resolution of that down to the individual and down to families that are affected by floods. So go to where the motivation is, people that have been really devastated or towns that have had a lot. Actually, so the town, the municipality has an emergency management plan, but the actual people in the town, especially the affected ones, and actually can make their own plans. And there's there's actually systems to do that are set up. They're actually really good, kind of pretty cool systems. They really have self-reflection in them. They have who's around, map your neighbors and who has what, and do that kind of stuff. So I think that kind of connection putting some effort into that. What you have is motivated learners, right? There are people who actually said, I know what this is like and I want to do something about it. So it is something where they're actually need to connect to prepare, and that's an act of resilience in and of itself. So if you think of watershed resilience or community resilience, that's happening. If you could get 200 people that would write about their own, what they have and where their liabilities are and who their neighbors are and who did just that and like doing it in a setting where you get like free hot dogs and whatever, like that's the kind of thing that if it was multiplied across the state, we could throw a little money at, I think could really help. It would then feed into this higher level stuff.
Sorry, I raised my hand over here. I actually feel like from the past couple of years that our short-term during hazard communication in Vermont is actually quite effective in terms of lives saved, not necessarily in terms of property loss. But one of the things I'm more interested in moving forward is how do we communicate the longer term, particularly when it comes to where we're rebuilding, what sort of infrastructure we're putting back. In my town of Richmond, we've rebuilt the same sections of road 3 times in 2 years, using the same exact methods. And there have been people who have lost the culverts at the end of their driveway 3 times in 2 years. And how do we communicate, and then how do we develop the processes and maybe it's government intervention as well to say that if your culvert at the end of your driveway washes out 3 times in 2 years, it will probably happen again in the future. And so that there are ways to avoid that. That's kind of what I think about, and I'm curious what your experiences and responses are.
Yeah, I think that's,
go ahead.
that's sort of what with the having a recovery plan, preparing for public assistance funding. That's exactly what I'm trying to get at is FEMA will come in, they will write you a project worksheet that says put road back, do it the same way you always do next, and they'll move on. And if the town doesn't have a plan for what would we do if this came in, and they're not there pushing FEMA to say, no, we can do an improved project. We know that that's a thing. You can't just write this worksheet to say, put it back again. We've done this before, we've been there. And having the tools to actually do that. And the will to actually do that, right? Because a lot of times it is the road foreman just goes back and does it because that's what they do. And so it is not all events are declared. We're sort of in a weird place in Vermont where our state threshold is significantly lower than most states, given our rural nature. And it's a lot easier for us to get a federally declared disaster than a lot of the rest of the country, which is an interesting dynamic that helps us get these events declared. But when we have those opportunities, we've had 7 in the last 2 years, federally declared disasters. If that bridge blew out, maybe it doesn't need to be there. Like, well, how do we talk about rerouting? How do we plan those things in advance so that when it does happen, I think the problem is with communities that are really hard hit, they're not in a position to make those decisions because they don't have the capacity. They're just trying to stay alive. So they're not in that space to be able to push things. And that's the opportunity when they need to be able to do it.
I think that also that's absolutely right. And having short-term engagement, like say short-term planning for actually response. If a lot of people do that in a town, they are actually engaged and motivated. And then some of the energy of the burnout can be infused and people become more involved in the project. So you need the technology, the technical expertise, right, to do the projects, but you also need the willpower and sort of energy of, say, a town to say, okay, I'm not going to do that again. We just had that. Like, yeah, no, because once you start getting involved and you build some expertise, you build confidence and you build kind of this ability to move on projects where you might be passive if you were otherwise not involved.
And if I can add one more thing on that, I will say, I think so people's memories are short. Tropical Storm Irene happened. It was a tropical storm in Vermont. That feels like an anomaly, right? And a few years later, it's not as much of a conversation anymore because it hasn't happened. And what are the chances of that? It's a 100-year flood. Well, we don't call it that anymore, but for obvious reasons. But in 2023, it just rained too much. And I think that hit people differently, but also flooding on the exact anniversary a year later really hit people differently because in my communications with the town, so prior to the flooding in 2023. I'm out there talking to towns, trying to convince them to care about flooding. Like we did these tours with all of the American Rescue Plan Act dollars. We're talking about broadband and housing. And I'm like, please care about flooding, like jumping up and down in the back of the room. Please pay attention to this. And it's just when you have those other big things to care about, it's harder to care about that. But I think we're seeing communities lean in a way now that they have not done before. So I'm very hopeful about that. And some of them are leaning in and doing, especially on the buyouts, like in Plainfield, 26 property buyouts. It's the majority of their downtown housing. They're recognizing we can't be here anymore, and they don't have a plan yet, but they're trying to get there. And I think that having that faith to lean in and do this thing because it's the thing they need to do is a really hard thing for a town that small to do, but we're seeing that. We're seeing people start and then trying to figure out how do we help them connect the pieces to planning for new development, getting things set up so that they can get grants around future building of housing, et cetera.
All right, so we have 1 minute.
Right.
Really lightning round. But I just want to hear from each of you one important lesson you learned from the recent big floods we've had in Vermont.
I think I just gave my answer, so you guys start.
Yeah, no, it's nothing new. I think we have to have the plans in place because when you get into that flood event, you don't have the capacity to really think about how do we build that more resiliently. It's just get the culvert back and, and if that culvert, that undersized culvert sitting down there within, arm's length of the excavator, grab that, slap it in and put the road back over it because these people need to get out. So we need to have the plans in place going into these events. Yeah.
I learned that these big scale sort of disaster events, whether it's a personal thing in one's life or like a town flooding, that it has to be bad enough. And it was bad enough, like for a lot of people. And to see that trigger point when everyone comes together and starts building coalitions and building trust, it's like doing things and it lasts for a certain amount of time. It's like this window of opportunity, like the carbohydrate window after you exercise, like you capture it. And that like actually going where that energy is and really trying to capture it is really important. I think it's an important part of the solutions that need to emerge.
All right, with that, I think we'll end things. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to everyone in the room and to everyone online. This was a great session. Yeah, join us for the next ones. They'll be announced.
February 10th.
For those in the room, there are refreshments on the other side of this wall. We welcome you to stick around.
Thank you.
Shayne, I would love to chat with you about the